first, let's talk about what's happening in Ecuador and Haiti and place it inside the history of the World Bank and IMF, whose fingerprints are always all over these crises. Let's start with some footage. I don't think there's less sound to this one. This is from Haiti. This is from the People's Dispatch, which is a really good channel. I would subscribe to it. They have a little bit of a video primer explaining what's been happening in Haiti over the last real year, basically. And what you have in Haiti, going back, if you want to take it to the founding of the country, is an ongoing punishment from Western powers for freeing itself from slavery. Literally, Haiti was forced to pay off the French a debt for liberating itself from slavery. Let that sink in. Fast forward, after supporting multiple military dictatorships, which guided through World Bank and IMF structural adjustment plans, which we'll get to briefly, we'll get to in a moment. You saw a 2004 U.S.-backed coup against Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a whole complex that implicates U.S. corporations, the UN, peacekeeping forces, and many others that subjugate Haiti and continue to impose austerity. And there's multiple uprisings happening now against the entire political infrastructure, the corrupted local elites, as well as Western capital. In Ecuador, which we'll get to, have some footage of Ecuador as well. We'll actually play some footage from this report from the Real News Network. This will contextualize some of what just happened in Ecuador, where Lenin Moreno, who was the successor to pink-tide leftist president Rafael Correa, has gone on a hard far-right course. Let's play a minute of this report from the Real News Network.
Repression and a general upheaval in Ecuador, the government of President Moreno and the most important indigenous organizations agreed to engage in negotiations to discuss the cancellation of austerity measures that President Moreno had imposed about 2 weeks ago following the IMF prescriptions. The economic measures included a near doubling of fuel prices, about 23,000 layoffs in the public sector, and the deregulation of labor laws, following a neoliberal model. As soon as the measures were announced, protesters came walking and in caravans from different regions of Ecuador. They started to arrive at Quito on Saturday, October 5th, and continued arriving for over 11 days. They marched to demand the cancellation of the IMF decree that would directly affect the poorest. One of the main organizations behind the protest and the strike was CONAIE, the Confederation of Indigenous Nations of Ecuador.
Now, Moreno has backed down, but bear in mind that as soon as he assumed the presidency in 2017, even though he campaigned in the center-left, he's governed in a hard-right fashion, and he had a brutal response to the initial protests, and leftist leaders are still being arrested across the country. And Rafael Correa is still wanted in Ecuador on almost certainly trumped up charges in the vein that put President Lula in jail. So common to both of these case studies is the World Bank and IMF. The World Bank and IMF emerged from the Bretton Woods post-World War II system. One institution, the IMF, to try to control and regulate global currency exchange, and the World Bank, which was tasked with development and poverty reduction. What this has meant in practice is an imposition of very tightly regulated orthodox economic policies that have starved public resources across the globe and made environments in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe friendly to Western capital. And I want to cite somebody that we did an illicit history with for patrons. There's a book called The Globalists by Quinn Slobodian, who's an economic historian. And he made a really important distinction here, which is that the rhetoric that is used by the advocates of laissez-faire and the people that run these institutions that regulate these global trade and global economic frameworks, they talk a lot about freedom of capital, deregulation, lessening bureaucratic burdens, by which they always mean cutting public resources and gutting government, right? And that somehow in contrast to that, there's freedom and fluidity in capital that is innate and liberating and prosperity creating. Well, we already see, and that's not the case. There's still significant structural poverty in the world. And in fact, even after a kind of relative overall decrease in the last several decades, mainly led by the enormous reversals in China, but also in some respects led by, as an example, the pink tide, which took 70 million people out of poverty in Latin America between 2000 and 2014 by not following these policy prescriptions. Some of these, World Bank and IMF, have self-assessed that their own policies don't necessarily work in terms of poverty reduction. But back to Slobodian, these policies are very rigid. They're very regimented. They're tightly regulated. They're just tightly written and regulated in a way that benefits Western capital. And as long as that is the case, you will have these uprisings. You will have this fundamental conflict that you see in Ecuador and Haiti over the last couple of weeks. And we have an obligation to extend our sense of global solidarity in a practical sense for how these institutions are governed and how we deal with them. We saw this in Greece. That's why we played the Bernie Sanders Cold Open. And of course, Bernie is the only one who has spoken in solidarity with the Ecuador and Haiti protests. And that isn't just a point scoring in a presidential campaign, although it is. It's an important fundamental point about where we're really coming from in terms of a global 1% versus a global 99%, understanding that these systems are globally connected and need to be confronted globally, particularly in the center where so many of our institutions still benefit from these predator arrangements. Matt, what do you think?
Well, we sort of alluded to this with Andre Demise in the pre-show that we did today. But
everybody should read this book.
It's free online, so if you're getting this now, you can just download it. The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, the anti-Stalinist communist writer, Marxist writer.
Anti-Stalinist communist, yep, the independent Marxist. He was a Trotskyite, but graduated from them too.
So
he got all of the major calls of the 20th century right.
Yep. So everybody should read Black Jacobins.
And check out the primer that I did on the TMBS channel on the Black Jacobins. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.